Your last meal is getting cold, and frankly, that's the least of your problems. Drop a comment with what time you're watching this, because misery loves company, and smash that like button. Subscribe for more cheerful content about our ancestors' hobbies. Throughout history, humans have shown remarkable creativity when it comes to permanent problem solving. Every civilization had their preferred. You're about to experience what it felt like to be on the wrong end of history's most memorable final acts. From ancient Rome's theatrical productions to modern America's clinical efficiency, we'll walk through every gruesome detail your ancestors endured. Because ending people nicely was never really the point. Part 1. Crucifixion Roman Empire 1st century CE. The Romans didn't just kill you, they made it a bloody spectacle. You're dragged through the dusty streets of ancient Rome, carrying your own crossbeam like the world's worst delivery job. The crowd isn't exactly throwing flowers, and the Roman soldiers aren't known for their customer service skills. The Romans picked crucifixion for very practical reasons. It was cheap, just some wood and nails. It was public, everyone could see what happened to troublemakers. And it was slow, giving plenty of time for the message to sink in. Plus, it was reserved for slaves and non-citizens, so it carried the extra sting of social humiliation. Here's the thing about Roman executions. They were basically state-sponsored theatre. The whole empire ran on the idea that Caesar was divine, and challenging that got you the worst possible send-off. Crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was performance art designed to keep the masses in line. You'd think being nailed to wood would be the main event, but the Romans were surprisingly practical about the whole thing. They nailed through the wrists, not the palms like all those Renaissance paintings suggest, because palms tear too easily, and the whole project falls apart. Can't have shoddy craftsmanship ruining the spectacle. The real genius of crucifixion was its efficiency. One cross could be reused multiple times, and the whole setup required minimal maintenance. Just plant it outside the city walls and let gravity do most of the work. The Romans were nothing if not cost-effective with their punishment budget. What really made this method special was the crowd participation. Spectators came and went like it was a festival. Some brought lunch, others placed bets on survival times. The record holder apparently lasted 2 days, though that's probably not the kind of record anyone wanted to hold. The location was carefully chosen too, Golgotha. The place of skulls was positioned right outside Jerusalem's main gate. Every traveller entering or leaving the city got a front-row view of what happened to people who crossed Rome. Talk about effective advertising. The Romans even had professional executioners who knew exactly how to keep you conscious for the maximum amount of time. Too quick, and you missed the educational value. Too slow, and it became a logistics nightmare. There was apparently an art to getting the timing just right. Different social classes got different treatment, even in death. Roman citizens were usually beheaded quick and relatively dignified. Slaves and foreigners got the full crucifixion experience. Even in execution, the Romans maintained their rigid social hierarchy. The whole process could take anywhere from hours to days, depending on your constitution and the weather. Summer executions were faster because of dehydration. Winter ones dragged on because your body lasted longer in the cold. Seasonal execution planning was apparently a thing. But here's where it gets really twisted. Sometimes family members were allowed to bribe the executioners for a quicker death, a spear to the side, some poison, or just breaking your legs to speed things up. Even death had a price tag in ancient Rome. The aftermath was just as calculated. Bodies stayed on the crosses until they fell apart naturally, which could take months. This served as a long-term reminder and also fed the local wildlife, which probably appreciated the steady food supply. But while Rome was perfecting their outdoor theatre of death, medieval Europe was cooking up something completely different. They looked at Roman efficiency and decided what the world really needed was more fire. Part 2. Burned at the stake medieval Europe, revised. Speaking of creative solutions, medieval Europe looked at Roman crucifixion and said, "Hold my ale." You're standing in the town square tied to a wooden post. surrounded by enough kindling to fuel a weekend camping trip. Except this particular fire isn't being built for roasting marshmallows. The executioner is approaching with a torch, and frankly, his customer service ratings are probably terrible. Medieval Europeans chose burning for surprisingly practical reasons. The church approved it because fire supposedly purified the soul, which was convenient theological marketing for what was essentially state-sponsored barbecuing. It also completely destroyed any evidence of witchcraft along with the accused, solving multiple problems simultaneously. But here's the thing about medieval witch trials. Most witches weren't actually casting spells or flying around on broomsticks. Shocking revelation, right? You probably just knew some herbal remedies, lived alone as an older woman, or owned a black cat. Medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for rigorous evidence standards or logical thinking. Your crime might have been as simple as having a bad harvest in your neighborhood, looking at someone the wrong way, or being too good at midwifery. When the Black Death was killing everyone anyway, people needed someone to blame, and pointing fingers at witches was easier than understanding basic hygiene or germ theory. The witch craze really took off around the 14th century, when life was already miserable for most people. Economic disasters, plagues, and political instability made everyone paranoid, and burning suspected witches became medieval Europe's favorite stress relief activity. Group therapy through group execution, essentially. Joan of Arc got the full burning treatment in 1431, though her main crimes were wearing men's clothing and claiming God spoke to her personally. The English were particularly annoyed that a teenage French peasant girl was giving them military advice, so they decided fire was the appropriate response to feminist leadership. The executioners were surprisingly professional about the whole business. They had specific techniques for building pyres. Too much green wood created smoke without heat. Too much dry wood burned too fast to provide proper educational value for the spectators. Medieval crowd management required careful fire engineering. Some executioners were secretly merciful. They'd strangle condemned prisoners with hidden ropes before lighting the fire, or place bags of gunpowder around necks to speed things up. These guys risked their own jobs to reduce suffering, which shows that even in medieval times, some people had functioning consciences. The crowds treated burning days like medieval carnivals. Vendors sold food and drink. Children played games nearby, and couples used executions as date activities. Nothing says romance quite like watching someone burn for witchcraft, apparently. Medieval entertainment standards were remarkably flexible. Different regions had their own burning traditions. Some places used tall stakes to keep victims above the flames. More smoke inhalation, less actual burning. Others used short stakes that put people right in the fire. Regional preferences in execution methods were like local cuisine, except with more screaming. The Spanish Inquisition turned burning into elaborate theatrical productions with their auto de fe ceremonies. These were massive public events with processions, speeches, and multiple burnings. They basically turned religious persecution into entertainment spectacle, complete with reserved seating for VIPs and program booklets. Here's a fun historical fact. Many supposed witches were actually early scientists, herbalists, or just women who were smarter than their neighbors. Their magic potions were often legitimate medicines, and their supernatural knowledge was usually basic understanding of things like weather patterns or chemistry. Medieval Europe was not a great time to be intellectually ahead of your neighbors. The whole witch-burning phenomenon eventually died out when people realized it wasn't actually solving any problems. Shocking discovery, burning wise women didn't improve crop yields, stop diseases, or fix any of the actual issues plaguing medieval society. Who could have predicted that scapegoating wouldn't work? The last witch execution in Europe was in 1782, meaning this charming tradition survived well into the supposedly enlightened 18th century. Progress comes slowly, especially when it involves admitting you've been burning innocent people for centuries based on superstition and paranoia. But while medieval Europe was busy with their fire-based problem-solving methods, Tudor England was developing a more direct approach to dealing with troublesome individuals. Sometimes they figured, you just needed to cut straight to the point. Part 3. Beheading by axe. Tudor England. Tudor England decided that all this fire business was getting a bit theatrical, so they went with the direct approach. You're kneeling on the scaffold in front of the Tower of London, and honestly, the real estate value here is probably terrible given the neighbourhood's reputation. The executioner is sharpening his axe, which would be reassuring if it weren't for the obvious context. The Tudors chose beheading because it was supposedly more humane than burning, and it carried a certain aristocratic dignity. Only the nobility got their heads chopped off. Commoners still got hanged like peasants. Even in death, class distinctions mattered in Tudor England. Henry VIII made beheading fashionable, though probably not in the way he intended. He went through wives faster than most people go through shoes, and two of them ended up meeting the executioner's axe. Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard both discovered that disappointing the king was a career-limiting move. Here's the thing about Tudor executions. They were surprisingly expensive affairs. The executioner was a skilled professional who commanded high fees. A good headsman could charge £20 for a clean job. That's about £15,000 in today's money. Quality workmanship wasn't cheap. Even in the 1500s, the location mattered too. Tower Hill was the premium execution venue, reserved for high-profile nobles and political prisoners. It had grandstand seating, vendors selling refreshments, and even programs listing the day's events. Execution tourism was apparently a thriving business. Your crime was probably treason, which in Tudor times could mean anything from actually plotting against the king to just annoying him at the wrong moment. The definition of treason was remarkably flexible under the Tudors, which kept the executioners busy and the nobility nervous. The executioner wore a hood not for dramatic effect, but for job security. These guys needed to work regularly, and walking around town as the person who chopped off Lord So-and-so's head wasn't great for your social life. Anonymity was a professional necessity. Some executioners were celebrities in their own right. The Tower of London's chief executioner during Henry's reign was known for his clean one-stroke technique. He took pride in his work, which is oddly admirable when you think about it. Professional standards mattered, even in the head removal business. The axe itself was a specialized tool. These weren't garden variety wood-cutting axes, they were specifically designed for neck sivering, longer handles for better leverage, heavier heads for clean cuts, and carefully maintained edges. The executioner's tools were probably better cared for than most people's kitchen knives. Different countries had different beheading preferences. The French preferred swords, which required more skill but looked more elegant. The Germans liked their traditional axes. The English stuck with axes too, probably because they were practical and got the job done without too much fuss. Anne Boleyn got special treatment. Henry imported a French swordsman specifically for execution because he thought it would be more dignified. Even in divorce proceedings that ended in death, Henry tried to maintain some class, though one wonders if Anne appreciated the gesture. The whole process was surprisingly ritualized. You got to make a final speech, usually praising the king who was about to have you killed. Then you knelt, placed your head on the block, and hoped the executioner had his morning coffee and was feeling accurate. Professional executioners developed techniques to minimize suffering. A sharp axe, proper positioning, and a strong, confident swing could separate head from body in a single stroke. Amateur executioners sometimes needed multiple attempts, which was considered poor form and resulted in very unhappy customers. The crowd dynamics were fascinating. Tudor audiences were surprisingly polite during executions. They'd cheer the final speech, gasp at the actual beheading, and then applaud the executioner's technique. It was like watching a particularly violent theatre performance with audience participation. Bodies were usually buried immediately, but heads sometimes got displayed on spikes as warnings. London Bridge was decorated with the heads of traitors, creating what was essentially a medieval hall of fame for people who annoyed the government. Tourism boards today would probably struggle to market that attraction. But while the Tudors were perfecting their aristocratic head removal service, the French were looking at the whole beheading business and thinking it needed some serious modernization. They were about to revolutionize execution, the same way they revolutionized everything else. Part 4. Guillotine French Revolution, 1790s. The French looked at centuries of messy, unreliable executions and decided what the world really needed was some proper engineering. You're lying face down on a wooden plank, your neck positioned in a half-moon groove that fits disturbingly well. Above you, a 40-pound steel blade waits at the top of 2 wooden rails. The whole contraption looks like something a particularly morbid carpenter might build after reading too many physics textbooks. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine didn't actually invent the guillotine. The honor goes to Antoine Louis, a surgeon who understood anatomy, but Guillotine promoted it as a humane, egalitarian way to execute people. Finally, he argued, rich and poor could die with equal efficiency. Revolutionary thinking. Quite literally. The French Revolution was having an execution crisis. They were killing so many people that traditional methods couldn't keep up with demand. Hand-swinging axes were too slow, too unreliable, and frankly too exhausting for the executioners. Industrial-scale revolution required industrial-scale solutions. Your crime was probably something that would barely raise eyebrows today, criticizing the government, hoarding grain, or just being related to someone the revolutionaries didn't like. The revolution had a very broad definition of enemy of the people, which kept the guillotine busy around the clock. The device was tested extensively before its public debut. They used corpses from hospitals, then sheep, then finally condemned criminals. The French approached execution with scientific rigor, measuring drop distances, blade angles, and cutting efficiency. This was precision engineering applied to the neck-severing business. The guillotine was remarkably egalitarian for its time. Previously, nobles got beheading while commoners were hanged, drawn, or quartered. Now everyone got the same clean, quick death regardless of social status. It was probably the most democratic thing about the entire revolution. Executions became daily entertainment in Paris. The guillotine was set up in public squares, and crowds gathered like they were attending outdoor theatre. Vendors sold programs, refreshments, and even miniature guillotines as souvenirs. Capitalism found a way to profit from revolution, as it always does. The machine was surprisingly portable. The whole apparatus could be assembled and disassembled for transport to different locations. Revolutionary justice was a travelling show that could set up shop anywhere in France. Local governments probably competed to host execution events. Charlotte Corday, who assassinated Marat in his bathtub, was one of the guillotine's more famous customers. She maintained her composure right up until the end, apparently viewing her execution as the final act of her political statement. Revolutionary times produced some remarkably determined people. The executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, became something of a celebrity. His family had been royal executioners for generations, and suddenly they found themselves serving the revolution instead. Talk about adapting to changing political climates. Sanson apparently kept detailed records of his work, creating the world's most morbid professional journal. The speed was the guillotine's selling point. From the moment you were positioned to the moment your head hit the basket took about 3 seconds. No time for panic, no opportunity for last-minute rescues, no chance for the executioner to have an off day. Efficiency was the watchword. But the French got a bit carried away with their new toy. During the Terror, the guillotine worked overtime. Some days saw dozens of executions, turning the public squares into production lines. Robespierre himself eventually met the machine he'd helped make famous, which is irony at its finest. The crowd dynamics were unique to revolutionary France. Spectators weren't just watching they were participating in democracy. Every falling head was a victory for the people. Every execution a step toward equality. The guillotine became a symbol of popular justice, though the definition of justice was somewhat flexible. Different cities developed their own execution traditions. Some painted their guillotines in patriotic colors, others decorated them with revolutionary slogans. The machine that was supposed to represent equality became a canvas for local expression. The psychological impact was enormous. The guillotine's efficiency made mass executions possible, but it also made them routine. Death became industrial, systematic, almost boring in its reliability. The machine stripped away the personal element of execution, turning it into bureaucratic procedure. Eventually, even the revolutionaries got tired of all the killing. The guillotine was retired from daily use, though it remained France's official execution method until 1977. Some traditions die hard, even when they involve literally dying hard. But while the French were perfecting mechanical execution, 18th century England was sticking with more traditional methods. Sometimes they figured the old ways were the best ways, even if they occasionally went spectacularly wrong. Part 5. Hanging 18th century England. While the French were busy with their fancy mechanical contraptions, 18th century England stuck with rope and gravity. You're standing on a wooden platform at Tyburn, London's premier execution venue, with a hemp rope around your neck that's definitely not there for fashion purposes. The crowd below looks like they're attending a particularly morbid festival, complete with vendors selling everything from meat pies to execution broadsheets. The English chose hanging because it was cheap, simple, and required minimal equipment. A rope, a tree, and gravity. What more did you need? While other countries were investing in elaborate execution machinery, England kept things traditional. Why fix what wasn't broken, even if it occasionally was literally broken? Your crime could have been anything from murder to stealing a sheep worth more than a shilling. 18th century England had over 200 capital offences, including pickpocketing, cutting down trees, and being in the company of gypsies for a month. The legal system wasn't exactly known for its proportional responses. Tyburn was the premier hanging venue, located where Oxford Street meets the Edgware Road today. Imagine doing your Christmas shopping where people used to get executed for stealing Christmas dinner. London's urban planning has always been somewhat macabre. The journey to Tyburn was part of the show. Condemned prisoners rode in carts through the streets, stopping at taverns along the way for their final drinks. Some arrived at their execution completely drunk, which was probably the smartest approach to the whole situation. Professional hangmen were surprisingly skilled artisans. They calculated rope length based on your weight and height, aiming for that sweet spot where your neck broke cleanly without your head coming off entirely. Too short and you strangled slowly. Too long and you got decapitated, which was considered poor workmanship. The crowd dynamics were fascinating. Hanging days were public holidays where entire families came to watch. Children played games nearby, while parents debated the finer points of rope technique. It was family entertainment in an era before Netflix, which really puts things in perspective. Some condemned prisoners became folk heroes. Dick Turpin, the famous highwayman, reportedly dressed in his finest clothes and chatted with the crowd before his execution. His last words were apparently about hiring a horse, which showed remarkable commitment to his brand even in death. The authorities tried to make hangings educational experiences. Priests gave sermons, the condemned made speeches about their wicked ways, and everyone was supposed to learn valuable lessons about crime not paying. Whether anyone actually learned anything is debatable, but the entertainment value was undeniable. Different regions had different hanging traditions. Some used multiple ropes for group executions. Others specialized in elaborate gallows with trapdoors. The West Country developed a reputation for particularly efficient hangmen, while London executioners were known more for their showmanship. Women were hanged differently than men, usually with their faces covered to preserve modesty, because apparently there was something indecent about watching a woman die that didn't apply to watching men die. 18th century sensibilities were nothing if not selective. The timing was everything in a good hanging. Professional executioners developed techniques to ensure quick, clean breaks. Amateur jobs could result in slow strangulation that lasted 20 minutes or more, which was considered unseemly and unprofessional. Body snatchers were a real problem at hangings. Medical schools needed corpses for anatomy lessons, and fresh execution victims were premium merchandise. Families sometimes fought pitched battles with resurrection men trying to steal their relatives' bodies for science. The last words industry was surprisingly robust. Condemned prisoners' final speeches were recorded, printed, and sold as broadsheets. Some criminals prepared elaborate farewell addresses, turning their executions into performance art. Death was apparently good for book sales. Hanging survived longer than most execution methods because it was so practical. No expensive equipment, no specialized training required, and the setup could be erected anywhere. It was the execution method equivalent of IKEA furniture, simple, functional, and surprisingly durable. But while England was perfecting their rope-based justice system, medieval England had experimented with something far more elaborate. For really serious crimes, they'd developed a punishment that made simple hanging look positively merciful. Part 6. Drawing and Quartering England, 13th century. Medieval England looked at simple hanging and thought, this needs more horses. You're lying on a wooden hurdle being dragged through the streets of London behind a horse, and the cobblestones aren't exactly providing a smooth ride. The crowd is following along like you're leading some sort of parade, except parades usually don't end with the guest of honor being torn apart by farm animals. Drawing and quartering was reserved for high treason, which in medieval England meant anything that really annoyed the king. Plotting against the crown, counterfeiting money, or just being Scottish at the wrong time could all qualify. The punishment was designed to be so horrific that it would discourage others from similar career choices. The process had 4 distinct phases because medieval England believed in thoroughness. First came the drawing, being dragged to the execution site on a hurdle. This wasn't meant to kill you, just rough you up a bit and provide some pre-show entertainment for the spectators. Your crime was probably something that threatened royal authority. William Wallace got the full treatment for leading Scottish resistance against English rule. The English really didn't appreciate his freedom speeches and decided to make an example that would resonate across medieval Europe. The hanging came next, but this wasn't your standard neck-breaking affair. You were hanged just until you were nearly unconscious, then cut down while still alive. Medieval executioners had to be surprisingly precise. Too long on the rope and you'd miss the rest of the show. Too short and you'd be too lively for the subsequent procedures. Then came the disemboweling while you were still conscious, because medieval England believed in educational experiences. This part was usually when spectators started losing their lunch, though some hardened veterans kept cheering. Different crowds, different tolerance levels for anatomical demonstrations. The final act involved 4 horses pulling your limbs in different directions until something gave way. This was the quartering part, and it required some serious coordination between the horse handlers. Medieval England may not have had modern project management, but they understood the importance of teamwork. The whole spectacle could take hours from start to finish, which was excellent value for the entertainment budget. Medieval people didn't have television, so public executions served as both justice and primetime programming rolled into one gruesome package. Different parts of your body were displayed in different locations around the kingdom. Your head might end up on London Bridge, while your limbs got distributed to various towns as reminders of what happened to traitors. It was like a medieval publicity campaign, except with body parts instead of posters. The executioner needed multiple skill sets for this job. Horse handling, rope work, knife skills, and crowd management were all part of the professional requirements. It wasn't a position you could just walk into without proper training and experience. King Edward I was particularly enthusiastic about drawing and quartering. He used it extensively against Scottish and Welsh rebels, turning it into his signature punishment. Some monarchs collected art or books. Edward apparently collected creative execution methods. The crowds were remarkably well behaved during these events. Medieval society had strict protocols for public executions, and spectators generally followed them. There was apparently proper etiquette for watching someone get torn apart by horses, which says something about medieval social norms. The punishment was so effective that it remained on English law books for centuries, though it was rarely used after the medieval period. The last recorded drawing and quartering was in 1682, which means this charming tradition survived well into the supposedly civilized modern era. Some condemned prisoners received royal mercy in the form of being killed before the quartering began. This was considered a gracious gesture from the crown, which really puts royal generosity in perspective. Medieval standards for mercy were apparently quite flexible. The horses used for quartering were specially trained for the job. Not every farm animal could handle the psychological pressure of being an execution assistant. These were professional horses with a very specific skill set, which is probably not something you'd put on a resume today. But while medieval England was perfecting their multi-stage execution process, ancient civilizations had developed their own unique approaches to group punishment. Sometimes they figured the whole community should participate in the justice process. Part C80. Stoning, Ancient Middle East. Ancient civilizations looked at individual executioners and thought, why not make this a community activity? You're standing in a pit outside the city gates, surrounded by a crowd of your former neighbors who are now holding rocks and looking distinctly unfriendly. The stones aren't huge boulders, they're carefully sized to ensure maximum participation time without ending things too quickly. Stoning was chosen because it distributed responsibility across the entire community. No single person was the executioner. Everyone participated, which meant everyone shared the moral burden. It was ancient crowdsourcing applied to capital punishment, which is either brilliant or terrifying depending on your perspective. Your crime was probably adultery, blasphemy, or witchcraft offences that were considered threats to the entire community's moral fabric. Ancient societies believed these sins could bring divine punishment on everyone, so everyone got to participate in the solution. Collective problem, collective response. The process was surprisingly regulated. Ancient law codes specified stone sizes, throwing distances, and even the order of participation. The witnesses to your crime got to throw first, followed by judges, then the general public. Even mob justice had proper procedures back then. The pit served multiple practical purposes. It kept you from running away, obviously, but it also ensured that stones thrown from above had maximum impact. Ancient engineering applied to execution venues showed the same attention to detail they used for irrigation systems and city walls. Different cultures had different stoning traditions. Some required the condemned to be buried up to the waist first, others used shallow pits. The Jewish tradition specified that the first stone had to be large enough to cause unconsciousness, which was considered merciful. Ancient mercy had very specific requirements. The crowd dynamics were fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Stoning transformed ordinary citizens into execution participants, which either reinforced community bonds or traumatized entire populations. Probably both, depending on the individual's psychological makeup and their relationship with the condemned. Ancient law codes were remarkably specific about stoning procedures. The Mosaic law required at least 2 witnesses to the crime, and those witnesses had to cast the first stones. If they refused, the execution couldn't proceed. Ancient justice systems had more safeguards than you might expect. The stones themselves were regulated by size and weight. Too small and they wouldn't cause sufficient damage. Too large and the execution would end too quickly. Ancient communities apparently had stone-sizing specialists who ensured optimal execution experiences. Job specialization took some interesting forms in ancient times. Some ancient cultures used stoning as a test of divine judgment. If you survived, it meant the gods had intervened on your behalf. If you didn't, well, justice had been served with celestial approval. It was trial by ordeal with community participation benefits. The location was usually outside the city walls to avoid ritual contamination. Ancient societies were very concerned about maintaining spiritual purity within their living spaces. Execution zones were designated areas where the community could handle necessary but unpleasant business without affecting daily life. Biblical accounts suggest that stoning could take considerable time, especially if the community wasn't fully committed to the project. Half-hearted stoning was apparently a real problem in ancient times, requiring judicial oversight to ensure proper execution completion rates. The practice created interesting social dynamics. Community members who were reluctant to participate could be viewed as sympathizers or moral weaklings. Peter pressure in ancient times was literally a matter of life and death, which puts modern social anxiety in perspective. Different regions developed variations on the basic stoning theme. Some used slings for increased accuracy and distance. Others relied on hand throwing for more personal involvement. Ancient communities were surprisingly innovative when it came to execution methodology. The psychological impact on participants was rarely discussed in ancient texts, but modern research suggests that collective violence creates lasting trauma in entire populations. Ancient communities probably dealt with what we'd now recognize as mass PTSD, though they lacked the vocabulary to describe it. But while ancient Middle Eastern cultures were perfecting community-based execution, ancient India was developing something far more spectacular. Sometimes they decided you needed an execution method that was both effective and absolutely unforgettable. Part 8. Death by Elephant, Mughal Empire, India. The Mughal Empire looked at all these execution methods and said, what we need is something with more pageantry and larger animals. You're lying on the ground in front of the imperial court, bound hand and foot, while a trained war elephant stands over you looking surprisingly calm for something about to commit murder. The Marit sits on its neck giving instructions because apparently even execution elephants need professional guidance. The Mughals chose elephant execution because it perfectly combined practicality with spectacle. Elephants were already part of the imperial military, so the infrastructure was in place. Plus, nothing said don't mess with the emperor quite like being crushed by a 3-ton animal in front of the entire court. Your crime was probably rebellion, treason, or just severely disappointing someone with political connections. Mughal justice was efficient but not particularly forgiving. The empire ran on strict hierarchies, and challenging authority was the fastest way to meet an elephant professionally. The elephants were specially trained for execution duty. These weren't random animals grabbed from the royal stables, they were professionals with specific skill sets. Some could step precisely on heads for quick deaths. Others were trained for slow crushing that maximized the educational value for spectators. The ceremony was elaborate. Elephant executions were state events with formal protocols, official witnesses, and detailed record keeping. The Mughal bureaucracy documented everything, including execution methods, which is why we know so much about their creative approach to capital punishment. Different emperors preferred different elephant techniques. Some favored the quick head crush method for efficiency. Others preferred the slow chest compression for dramatic effect. Personal preferences in execution styles were apparently part of imperial personality, like preferring particular artists or architectural styles. The Mahouts who guided execution elephants were elite professionals within the imperial household. Training an elephant to kill humans on command while remaining controllable required exceptional skill. These guys were probably paid very well and invited to all the best palace parties. Elephant executions served multiple political purposes. They demonstrated imperial power, entertained the court, and provided unforgettable object lessons for potential troublemakers. One execution could intimidate entire regions, making it cost-effective from a governance perspective. The animals themselves showed remarkable intelligence during these procedures. Historical accounts describe elephants that could distinguish between different types of execution orders, quick death versus prolonged crushing. Animal intelligence applied to capital punishment created some genuinely disturbing scenarios. Regional variations existed throughout the Mughal territories. Some provinces favored trampling, others preferred crushing, and a few specialized in tossing condemned prisoners into the air before the final crushing. Local preferences in execution styles reflected regional administrative cultures. The crowds were carefully managed during elephant executions. These events drew enormous audiences, so crowd control was essential. The Mughal administration treated executions like modern governments handle large public events, with detailed planning, security protocols, and traffic management. Some condemned prisoners received mercy in the form of being killed before the elephant arrived. A quick sword stroke or poisoned drink was considered gracious imperial clemency. Mughal mercy was relative. but at least it showed the emperor was thinking of your comfort. The timing of elephant executions was politically calculated. They often coincided with religious festivals or state celebrations, maximizing the audience and reinforcing imperial authority. Nothing enhanced a royal birthday party quite like a few public executions to remind everyone who was in charge. European visitors to Mughal courts were horrified and fascinated by elephant executions. Their accounts provide detailed descriptions of procedures they found both barbaric and impressive. Cultural exchange in the early modern period included comparing notes on execution methodologies. The practice continued well into the colonial period, though British administrators eventually banned it as part of their legal reforms. The last recorded elephant execution was in the 1800s, meaning this tradition survived longer than most medieval European methods. But while the Mughals were perfecting their elephant-based justice system, ancient Persia had developed something that made elephant crushing look positively merciful. Sometimes they decided the punishment should last for days rather than minutes. Part 9. Scaphism, Ancient Persia. Ancient Persia looked at all these quick execution methods and thought, what if we made dying take several days and involved insects? You're trapped between two narrow boats, bound so tightly you can barely move, with your head, hands, and feet sticking out through holes. Someone has just force-fed you milk and honey, and more honey is being smeared over your exposed skin. This is not the spa treatment you were hoping for. The Persians called this scaphism, from the Greek word for boat, though the boats in question were more like floating coffins designed by someone with a particularly creative imagination and too much time on their hands. Ancient Persia was known for elaborate punishments, and this was their masterpiece. Your crime was probably regicide or something equally serious. Scapism was reserved for the worst offences against the Persian state, killing kings, betraying the empire, or committing sacrilege. Regular criminals got regular executions. This was the premium punishment package. The boats were specially constructed for this purpose. They weren't repurposed fishing vessels. These were purpose-built execution devices designed to hold a human body while allowing access for the unpleasant parts. Persian craftsmen apparently took pride in their workmanship, even when building torture equipment. The milk and honey served multiple purposes. Either they kept you alive longer by providing nutrition, which was thoughtful in a deeply disturbing way, but they also attracted insects, which was the real point of the exercise. Ancient Persia understood that the best punishments were self-maintaining systems. You're placed in a stagnant pond or marsh where the insect population is particularly robust. Flies, wasps, beetles, and various other creatures that view honey-covered humans as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The Persian location scouts apparently had very specific criteria for execution venues. The timeline was what made scapism special. While other execution methods measured duration in minutes or hours, this could last for days or even weeks. Persian patience with punishment was legendary, and they had the logistics figured out to maintain extended execution experiences. The daily routine became grimly predictable. Each morning, guards would arrive to feed you more milk and honey, ensuring your continued survival and maintaining the insect attraction. Persian bureaucracy extended to execution maintenance schedules, which shows remarkable administrative attention to detail. Different insects contributed different elements to the overall experience. Flies laid eggs, beetles burrowed, wasps stung repeatedly, and various other creatures treated your helpless body like a combination buffet and nursery. Ancient Persia had essentially weaponized the entire local ecosystem. Historical accounts suggest that victims sometimes survived for 17 days, though the quality of that survival was questionable. Persian record-keeping included execution duration statistics, which implies they treated this as a measurable administrative outcome rather than simple cruelty. The psychological impact was probably worse than the physical effects. Knowing that each day would bring more of the same, with no hope of rescue or quick death, created a special kind of despair. Persian punishment philosophy apparently included advanced psychological warfare techniques. The guards responsible for maintenance were professional executioners with specialized training. Managing a multi-day execution while keeping the victim alive required genuine skill. These weren't casual torturers, they were technical specialists in extended death management. Weather became a significant factor in scaphism outcomes. Rain could wash away the honey, reducing insect activity, but also providing relief. Hot weather accelerated everything, while cold weather slowed the process. Persian executioners probably developed weather-based execution scheduling. The method was so horrific that it became legendary throughout the ancient world. Greek and Roman historians wrote detailed accounts of Persian scaphism, usually while expressing shock at barbarian cruelty. Though considering their own execution methods, this was somewhat hypocritical. Some victims apparently went insane before dying, which was considered part of the punishment. Ancient Persia believed that crimes against the state deserved comprehensive suffering that included mental breakdown. Their punishment philosophy was remarkably thorough and completely terrifying. The end came from infection, dehydration, or simply the accumulated effects of being eaten alive by insects for days. Persian patience with punishment was eventually satisfied, though the timeline was entirely up to nature and the local bug population. But while ancient Persia was perfecting their extended torture methods, ancient Carthage had developed something that combined religious ceremony with environmental execution. Sometimes they believed the gods themselves should participate in the punishment. Part 10. Modern Executions, the Clinical Approach. And so we arrive at modern times, where humanity finally learned to kill people efficiently and with proper medical supervision. You're lying on a gurney in a sterile room that looks more like a hospital than an execution chamber, which is probably the point. The 20th and 21st centuries decided that if we're going to kill people, we should at least do it professionally and preferably with paperwork. Modern America chose lethal injection because it looked medical and humane. No more messy public spectacles or medieval barbarism, just clean, clinical death administered by people in white coats. It was execution rebranded as a medical procedure, which made everyone feel more civilized about the whole thing. Your crime was probably murder, which is refreshingly straightforward compared to historical capital offences. No more getting executed for stealing sheep or annoying the king. Modern capital punishment has much higher standards. Progress comes in many forms, including narrow definitions of death-worthy crimes. The process involves 3 drugs administered in sequence: a sedative to make you unconscious, a paralytic to stop you from moving, and potassium chloride to stop your heart. It's like a chemically orchestrated shutdown sequence designed by pharmaceutical engineers with degrees in both medicine and death. But here's where modern execution gets complicated. Sometimes the drugs don't work properly. Botched lethal injections can result in prolonged consciousness while paralyzed, which is arguably worse than anything medieval executioners managed. Modern efficiency occasionally fails in spectacularly unpleasant ways. The witnesses sit behind glass like they're watching surgery, which in a way they are. Modern executions are performed for small, select audiences rather than public crowds. Democracy apparently decided that watching people die should be a privilege reserved for journalists, officials, and victim families. Different states have different execution preferences. Some stick with lethal injection. Others have brought back electric chairs, firing squads, or even gas chambers. American federalism extends to execution methods, creating a patchwork of death administration techniques across the country. The electric chair was supposed to be humane when it was invented in the 1880s. Thomas Edison promoted it as a clean, scientific alternative to hanging. The fact that it sometimes caught people on fire was considered a minor technical issue, rather than a fundamental design flaw. Gas chambers were introduced as another humane innovation, using hydrogen cyanide to cause unconsciousness before death. The historical associations with Nazi death camps eventually made this method politically uncomfortable, which shows that even execution methods can become problematic for reasons beyond their actual effectiveness. Firing squads made a comeback in some states because they're reliable and relatively quick. 5 shooters, 1 blank cartridge, so nobody knows who fired the fatal shot, and it's over in seconds. Sometimes the old ways really are the best ways, especially when modern pharmaceutical solutions keep failing. The costs of modern executions are astronomical compared to historical methods. Between legal appeals, specialized facilities, trained personnel, and medical supplies, executing someone in modern America costs millions of dollars. Medieval executioners would be amazed at how expensive killing people has become. The appeal process can take decades, meaning some death row inmates die of natural causes before their executions. Modern justice moves so slowly that time itself becomes an execution method. The efficiency our ancestors would have envied has been replaced by procedural thoroughness that defeats its own purpose. Prison staff who administer executions often require psychological counseling afterward. Modern society recognizes the mental health impact of killing people professionally, something historical executioners probably didn't get. Professional death administration comes with employee wellness programs now. The last public execution in America was in 1936, ending a tradition that dated back to colonial times. Modern sensibilities decided that watching people die wasn't appropriate family entertainment, which represents significant social progress or disappointing decline depending on your perspective. International opinion has turned against capital punishment entirely. Most developed countries abolished execution decades ago, viewing it as barbaric regardless of method. America finds itself in the same category as authoritarian regimes when it comes to state-sponsored killing, which is awkward diplomatically. Some states have struggled to obtain execution drugs because pharmaceutical companies refuse to supply them. European manufacturers won't sell lethal injection chemicals to American prisons, creating supply chain problems for death administration. Globalization has complicated even the execution business. The whole modern execution system reveals humanity's ongoing struggle with institutionalized killing. We've made it cleaner, more regulated, and theoretically more humane, but we're still fundamentally doing the same thing our ancestors did, using state power to end human lives for public purposes. And so ends our journey through history's greatest hits of permanent problem solving. From Roman crosses to American gurneys, humans have shown remarkable creativity in the death administration business. We've progressed from public spectacles to private procedures, from community participation to professional services, from crude tools to sophisticated pharmaceuticals. The methods have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains: how do you kill people in ways that society can live with? Every civilization has found different answers, and those answers reveal more about the societies than about the condemned individuals. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this entire historical survey is how normal all these methods seem to the people using them. Every generation believed their execution techniques were reasonable, necessary, and probably more humane than whatever came before, which makes you wonder what future civilizations will think about our current methods. Will lethal injection seem as barbaric to them as drawing and quartering seems to us? Will they look back at our execution chambers the way we look back at medieval torture devices? History suggests they probably will, and they'll probably be developing their own solutions to the eternal human problem of what to do with people who break society's most important rules. The methods change, but the challenge remains constant across all of human civilization. At least we've made progress in one area. We're no longer making it a family-friendly spectacle. That's something, right? Part 11. Thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, ancient Rome. The Romans weren't content with just crucifixion. They also pioneered gravity-based execution with scenic views. You're standing at the edge of an 80-foot cliff overlooking the Roman Forum, and the view would be spectacular if it weren't for the obvious fact that you're about to become part of it permanently. The Tarpeian Rock was Rome's solution for traitors who didn't deserve the full crucifixion treatment, but still needed to make a dramatic exit. The Romans chose cliff throwing for very specific crimes, mainly treason committed by Roman citizens. Crucifixion was for slaves and foreigners, but citizens got the express route down the Capitoline Hill. It was almost respectful if you ignored the whole hurling to your death aspect of the arrangement. Your crime was probably betraying military secrets, collaborating with enemies, or seriously undermining state security. The Romans were surprisingly precise about which traitors got which punishments. There was apparently a whole bureaucratic system for categorizing treasonous behavior. The location was carefully chosen for maximum symbolic impact. The Tarpeian Rock was part of the Capitoline Hill, one of Rome's 7 sacred hills and the religious heart of the empire. Getting thrown off it meant you were literally being cast out from the center of Roman civilization. The cliff was named after Tarpeia, a legendary Roman woman who betrayed the city to the Sabines in exchange for gold. According to the story, she was crushed by the shields of the soldiers she helped, then thrown from the rock. The Romans really believed in making their execution sites historically significant. Different emperors had different attitudes toward cliff throwing. Some used it regularly for political enemies, others preferred more elaborate punishments. Augustus was apparently quite fond of the Tarpeian Rock for dealing with senators who annoyed him, which must have made Senate meetings rather tense affairs. The actual throwing process was surprisingly ceremonial. You weren't just pushed off randomly. There were official procedures, witness requirements, and formal declarations. Even gravity-based execution had proper Roman bureaucratic protocols that had to be followed precisely. The timing was often coordinated with other state events. Multiple traitors might be thrown simultaneously during religious festivals or triumph celebrations. Rome knew how to turn execution into entertainment that reinforced imperial authority while providing educational value for the masses. Some condemned prisoners tried to commit suicide before reaching the edge, which was considered cheating. Roman guards developed techniques to prevent premature self-execution, because apparently even dying had to follow proper procedural guidelines in the empire. The crowd below in the forum could watch the entire process, making it both an execution and a public spectacle. Roman urban planning included sightlines for execution viewing, which shows remarkable attention to detail in city design. Even architecture served the purposes of state punishment. Historical records suggest that some people survived the fall, though probably not in any condition they'd have preferred. The Romans dealt with this occasional problem by having soldiers stationed at the bottom to finish the job. No detail was too small for proper Roman administration. The psychological impact on other potential traitors was enormous. Every time you looked up at the Capitoline Hill, you could see exactly where betraying Rome would get you. It was a constant visual reminder of the consequences of disloyalty, built into the city's geography. Different regions of the empire developed their own cliff-throwing traditions. Some provinces used natural rock formations, others built artificial precipices specifically for execution purposes. Local adaptation of imperial punishment methods showed the flexibility of Roman administrative practices. The practice continued well into the imperial period, though it became less common as other execution methods gained popularity. The last recorded Tarpeian rock execution was in the 3rd century, meaning this tradition lasted for over 600 years of Roman history. But while the Romans were perfecting their cliff-based justice system, medieval Europe was experimenting with more temperature-based solutions. Sometimes they figured the punishment should involve a lot more heat and a lot more screaming. Part 12. Boiled alive medieval Europe and Asia. Medieval Europe looked at all their existing execution methods and decided what the world really needed was more cooking involved. You're being lowered into a large cauldron filled with water that's been heating over a fire for the past hour. The executioner is taking his time about it, probably because rushing the process would defeat the entire educational purpose. Medieval Europe believed in thorough lessons, especially when it came to discouraging similar behavior in spectators. Boiling was chosen for specific crimes that medieval society found particularly disgusting. Poisoners were the primary candidates, based on the logic that if you killed people with liquid, you should die by liquid. Medieval justice had a poetic symmetry that modern legal systems completely lack. Your crime was probably poisoning someone important, counterfeiting coins, or practicing alchemy without proper authorization. Medieval Europe was very suspicious of people who mixed chemicals for any purpose. whether legitimate or nefarious. Chemistry wasn't really distinguished from witchcraft in most people's minds. King Henry VIII made boiling an official punishment in England after his cook was accused of poisoning a bishop. The law specifically targeted poisoners, showing that even Tudor England could be influenced by personal paranoia. Henry's relationship with food was complicated in many ways. The process was surprisingly technical. Medieval executioners had to maintain proper water temperature, too hot, and you died too quickly, too cool, and the crowd got bored. There was apparently optimal temperature management for execution by boiling, which required genuine skill and experience. Different regions preferred different cooking methods. Some used plain water, others added oil for higher temperatures, and a few experimented with wine or other liquids for special occasions. Medieval execution had local flavors that reflected regional preferences and available resources. The cauldrons were often municipal property, maintained by the city authorities specifically for execution purposes. These weren't repurposed cooking vessels. They were purpose-built execution equipment that required regular maintenance and proper storage. Medieval cities had execution infrastructure budgets. The timing could vary enormously depending on water temperature and the victim's constitution. Some boilings lasted minutes, others stretched to over an hour. Medieval crowds had different tolerance levels for extended execution entertainment, though most seemed surprisingly patient with the process. Professional executioners developed techniques to control the pace of boiling executions. Raising and lowering the victim, adjusting fire intensity, and managing water temperature were all part of the skill set. These guys were essentially medieval thermal engineers specializing in human cooking. The crowds were typically smaller for boiling executions than for other methods. Apparently watching someone slowly cook was less appealing than watching beheadings or hangings. Even medieval audiences had preferences when it came to execution entertainment. Some condemned prisoners received mercy in the form of being killed before the boiling began. A quick stab or strangulation was considered gracious, though it somewhat defeated the purpose of the elaborate cooking setup. Medieval mercy was often about the gesture rather than the practical outcome. The method was used in Asia as well, particularly in China and parts of the Ottoman Empire. Different cultures developed their own boiling traditions, showing that the idea of cooking people to death occurred independently to multiple civilizations. Human creativity in punishment methods was apparently universal. Records from medieval courts show detailed expense accounts for boiling executions. Firewood, cauldron maintenance, and executioner fees were all carefully documented. Medieval bureaucracy extended to execution cost accounting, which shows remarkable administrative thoroughness. The practice gradually died out as other execution methods became more popular and efficient. The last recorded boiling execution in Europe was in the 1600s, though some Asian countries continued the practice longer. Traditional execution methods had different lifespans in different regions, but while medieval Europe was perfecting their cooking-based punishments, other cultures were experimenting with even more claustrophobic solutions. Sometimes, they decided the earth itself should participate in the execution process. Part tress buried alive various cultures. Various ancient cultures looked at all these elaborate execution methods and thought, what if we just let the earth do all the work? You're standing in a pit that's exactly your height, and workers are shoveling dirt around your feet, while you contemplate the fact that this is probably the worst possible time to develop claustrophobia. The soil is rising steadily, and the crowd above is offering helpful commentary about proper burial techniques. Different cultures chose live burial for different reasons. Ancient Germanic tribes used it for cowards and deserters, believing that people who dishonored themselves in life should be dishonored in death. The Romans buried Vestal virgins alive if they broke their vows of chastity, because apparently violating sacred oaths required sacred punishment methods. Your crime probably involves some form of sacred violation or moral transgression that regular execution couldn't address. Live burial was reserved for offences against the natural or divine order. things so fundamentally wrong that they required the earth itself to reclaim the offender. The Romans were particularly systematic about live burial procedures. Vestal virgins who broke their vows were sealed in underground chambers with a small amount of food and water. This technically wasn't execution since the state wasn't directly killing them. They were just being returned to the earth with minimal supplies. Different regions developed different burial techniques. Some buried people vertically with only their heads exposed. Others used horizontal burial in shallow graves. A few cultures preferred sealed chambers that technically provided survival possibilities, though the odds were not encouraging. The psychological torture of live burial was often worse than the physical effects. Knowing that your air supply was limited while dirt pressed in from all sides created a unique form of terror that other execution methods couldn't match. Ancient cultures understood that some punishments needed psychological components. Ancient China used live burial extensively during periods of political upheaval. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, allegedly buried hundreds of scholars alive for possessing books he had banned. Chinese live burial was often politically motivated rather than criminally justified, which made it a tool of state control. Germanic tribes conducted live burial in bogs and marshes, where the acidic water preserved bodies for thousands of years. Modern archaeologists have found these bog bodies with evidence of the execution methods used. Ancient executions became inadvertent time capsules for modern forensic science. The timing of live burial varied enormously depending on soil type, burial depth, and atmospheric conditions. Sandy soil allowed faster digging but provided less structural support, while clay soil was harder to work with but created more stable burial chambers. Ancient executioners had to understand basic geology. Some cultures combined live burial with other punishments. The condemned might be tortured first, then buried while still conscious, or buried with various objects meant to increase suffering. Live burial was often part of larger punishment ceremonies rather than standalone executions. The crowds at live burial executions were typically more subdued than at other execution types. Watching someone disappear under dirt was less visually dramatic than beheadings or crucifixions, though the psychological impact was probably greater. Different execution methods appealed to different aspects of crowd psychology. Professional grave diggers sometimes doubled as executioners for live burial cases. These workers already had the tools and skills needed for digging human-sized holes, making them natural candidates for burial execution duties. Job diversification in ancient times took some unusual forms. Weather became a significant factor in live burial timing. Rain could flood burial sites, winter made digging difficult, and summer heat created additional suffering for both victims and workers. Ancient execution scheduling had to account for seasonal and meteorological variables. Some live burial victims were discovered years later by accident, their bodies preserved by unusual soil conditions. These discoveries provided historical evidence about execution methods and occasionally solved ancient legal mysteries. Archaeological excavation sometimes became inadvertent criminal investigation. The practice gradually declined as other execution methods became more popular and efficient. Live burial required significant labor and time investment, compared to hanging or beheading, making it impractical for societies with busy execution schedules. Economic efficiency eventually trumped symbolic value. But while various cultures were experimenting with earth-based execution, medieval Wallachia was developing something that made burial look positively merciful. Sometimes they figured the punishment should be visible from miles away and last for days. Part 14. Impalement Vlad the Impaler's Wallachia, 15th century. Vlad the Impaler looked at all the existing execution methods and thought, what this needs is more vertical presentation and artistic arrangement. You're lying on the ground while workers position a sharpened wooden stake that's been carefully prepared for this exact purpose. The stake is about 8 feet long, pointed but not too sharp. Vlad's executioners were professionals who understood that proper impalement required precise engineering rather than crude brutality. Vlad chose impalement because it served multiple strategic purposes. The process was slow enough to provide educational value, visible enough to terrorize enemies from great distances, and efficient enough to handle large numbers of prisoners when necessary. It was basically medieval psychological warfare with an artistic flair. Your crime might have been anything from theft to invasion, depending on Vlad's mood and political needs. He impaled Turkish prisoners, Wallachian criminals, Saxon merchants, and basically anyone who irritated him professionally or personally. Vlad was an equal opportunity impaler with very broad criteria for stake-worthiness. The stakes were specially prepared by skilled craftsmen who understood the technical requirements. Too sharp, and the process ended too quickly, too dull, and it wouldn't penetrate properly. The wood had to be properly seasoned, the point carefully shaped, and the length precisely calculated for the intended victim. Vlad's executioners developed techniques to ensure maximum survival time during impalement. The stake was inserted carefully to avoid major organs and blood vessels, allowing victims to survive for hours or even days. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate technical expertise applied to prolonged execution. The positioning was crucial for both practical and artistic reasons. Impaled victims were arranged in geometric patterns around Vlad's castle and throughout his territory. Approaching armies would encounter forests of stakes with gradually increasing victim densities as they neared Wallachian positions. Different types of criminals received different impalement treatments. Important prisoners got taller stakes in prominent positions, while common criminals were placed lower and toward the back. Even in death, Vlad maintained proper social hierarchies and organizational principles. The psychological warfare aspect was incredibly effective. Turkish armies sometimes retreated rather than advanced through Vlad's impalement forests. The sight of thousands of stakes with decomposing bodies created terror that extended far beyond the actual military threat posed by Wallachian forces. Vlad allegedly impaled over 20,000 people during his 6-year reign, though historical numbers are probably exaggerated. Medieval chroniclers weren't known for statistical accuracy, especially when describing rulers they found particularly noteworthy. Still, even conservative estimates suggest impressive impalement productivity. The logistics of mass impalement required considerable organizational skill. Vlad's administration had to coordinate stake production, execution scheduling, site preparation, and body disposal on an industrial scale. Medieval Wallachia developed execution management techniques that would impress modern project managers. Different regions within Vlad's territory specialized in particular aspects of the impalement process. Some areas focused on stake production, others on execution site preparation, and a few handled the actual impalement procedures. Regional specialization in execution methods showed sophisticated administrative planning. The maintenance of impalement forests required ongoing attention. Stakes had to be replaced as wood rotted, bodies removed when they became too decomposed, and new sites prepared as old ones filled up. Vlad's executioners were essentially landscape architects specializing in death displays. Foreign diplomats visiting Vlad's court often encountered fresh impalement displays, which was probably intentional diplomatic messaging. Nothing said "don't mess with Wallachia" quite like dining outdoors surrounded by people dying slowly on stakes. Medieval diplomacy had different entertainment standards than modern international relations. The method was so associated with Vlad that it became part of his historical identity. The Impaler wasn't just a nickname, it was a brand that defined his entire political and military strategy. Few historical figures became so thoroughly identified with their preferred execution method. But while Vlad was perfecting his stake-based artistry, ancient Greece was experimenting with more chemically sophisticated solutions. Sometimes, they figured, the most civilized approach to execution was letting the condemned person do the work themselves. Part 15. Poisoning hemlock. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece looked at all these violent execution methods and thought, what if we made dying into a philosophical experience? You're sitting in a prison cell in Athens, holding a cup of hemlock tea that looks deceptively normal for something designed to shut down your nervous system. The jailer is explaining the process with the same tone someone might use to describe a medical procedure, which is oddly comforting given the circumstances. The Greeks chose hemlock poisoning for citizens condemned to death because it was considered dignified and allowed the condemned to maintain their composure during the final moments. Unlike crucifixion or beheading, hemlock execution looked civilized and philosophical, which matched Athens' image as a center of learning and culture. Your crime was probably corrupting the youth or impiety against the gods, the same charges that got Socrates his famous cup of poison. Ancient Athens was surprisingly sensitive about intellectual crimes that threatened social stability, thinking the wrong thoughts could be just as dangerous as committing violent acts. Socrates himself described the hemlock experience during his final hours, providing history's most detailed account of philosophical execution. He compared the gradual numbness to a spreading coldness that eventually reached his heart. It was the world's first recorded experience of medically assisted death with running commentary. The hemlock plant contains contin, a neurotoxin that blocks nerve transmission throughout the body. Ancient Greek executioners understood the effects even if they didn't know the chemistry. The poison caused progressive paralysis starting from the extremities and moving toward vital organs. The process was surprisingly humane by ancient standards. Hemlock poisoning was relatively painless compared to crucifixion or burning, and it allowed the condemned to spend their final hours in conversation with friends and family. Athens treated execution as a social event rather than public spectacle. Different regions of Greece had different execution traditions. Sparta preferred more direct military methods, while Athens favored the philosophical approach. Regional variations in execution reflected broader cultural differences between Greek city-states and their values about death and dignity. The timing of hemlock execution was carefully managed. The poison took several hours to work completely, providing adequate time for final conversations, last wishes, and philosophical discussions. Ancient Greek execution scheduling allowed for proper emotional and intellectual closure. Professional poisoners were skilled technicians who understood dosage calculations based on body weight and constitution. Too little hemlock, and the execution failed. Too much, and the process became unpleasantly rapid. Ancient pharmacy required genuine expertise when applied to execution purposes. The location was usually private rather than public. Hemlock executions took place in prison cells or private homes rather than public squares, reflecting the Greek belief that dignified death should be a personal rather than communal experience. Athens separated execution from entertainment. Some condemned prisoners used their final hours to dictate philosophical treatises or settle intellectual debates. Socrates spent his last day discussing the immortality of the soul, turning his execution into a teaching moment. Ancient Greece produced the only execution method that doubled as educational opportunity. The psychological preparation for hemlock execution was elaborate. Condemned prisoners often spent weeks discussing their approaching death with philosophers and friends, treating the execution as the culmination of their life's intellectual journey. Ancient Greek death preparation was remarkably sophisticated. Family members were allowed to attend hemlock executions, and sometimes encouraged to participate in final conversations. The process was designed to provide closure for both the condemned and their loved ones, making it as much about healing relationships as ending life. The method influenced later philosophical thinking about death and dignity. Greek concepts of noble death shaped Roman Stoicism and eventually influenced modern debates about euthanasia and medical ethics. Ancient execution philosophy had lasting impact on how civilizations think about dying. But while ancient Greece was perfecting their philosophical approach to execution, other ancient civilizations were developing methods that turned death into artistic performance. Sometimes they figured execution should be both functional and aesthetically impressive. Part 16. The Brazen Bull, Ancient Greece, Rome. Ancient Greece and Rome looked at regular burning and thought, what this needs is better acoustics and more artistic presentation. You're being pushed into a hollow bronze bull that's been heated over a fire until the metal glows red hot. The interior is just large enough to hold a human body in a very uncomfortable position, and the whole contraption has been designed with acoustic properties that would make modern sound engineers either impressed or horrified. The brazen bull was invented by Perilaus of Athens for the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily, who wanted an execution method that combined practical death-dealing with artistic flair. The device was essentially a bronze sculpture that doubled as a sophisticated torture chamber, showing that ancient art could be both beautiful and terrifying. Your crime was probably opposing the tyrant's rule or committing some offense that required maximum deterrent effect. The brazen bull was reserved for special occasions when regular execution wasn't dramatic enough to send the proper political message. It was the ancient equivalent of making an example of someone. The bull was constructed with a door in the side for loading prisoners and a complex system of pipes and chambers that converted screams into sounds resembling bull noises. Ancient acoustic engineering was apparently more advanced than most people realize, especially when applied to torture devices. The heating process took considerable time and fuel, making this an expensive execution method reserved for important cases. The bronze had to reach specific temperatures to be effective, requiring skilled metal workers and experienced fire management. Ancient execution had surprisingly high technical requirements. Different rulers commissioned different versions of the brazen bull with varying artistic details and acoustic properties. Some were decorated with elaborate engravings, others focused on functional efficiency. Ancient dictators apparently had personal preferences in execution art that reflected their individual tastes. The inventor Perilaus reportedly became the bull's first victim when Phalaris decided to test the device on its creator. This established a precedent for ironic execution that appealed to ancient Greek sensibilities about justice and dramatic appropriateness. Even ancient tyrants appreciated good storytelling. The psychological impact on spectators was enormous. The combination of visual artistry and horrific sounds created a unique sensory experience that regular burning couldn't match. Ancient crowds were apparently quite sophisticated in their execution entertainment preferences. The bull required specialized maintenance and operation. Bronze conducts heat efficiently, but also cools quickly, so timing was crucial. The fire had to be maintained at proper levels, and the door mechanism needed regular care to prevent jamming during loading procedures. Roman emperors inherited the brazen bull tradition and used it occasionally for particularly dramatic executions. Some bulls were transported between cities as traveling execution devices, showing that portability was considered in the design. Ancient logistics extended to mobile torture equipment. The acoustic properties were the bull's most innovative feature. The internal pipe system was designed to transform human screams into bull-like bellowing, creating an artistic interpretation of death that satisfied both practical and aesthetic requirements. Ancient sound design had some disturbing applications. Historical records suggest that several tyrants throughout the ancient world commissioned their own versions of the brazen bull. The concept spread throughout the Mediterranean, showing that good execution innovations were quickly adopted by other rulers looking to upgrade their punishment capabilities. The device eventually fell out of favor as other execution methods became more popular and efficient. The brazen bull required too much preparation time and resources for routine use, making it impractical for rulers with busy execution schedules. Ancient efficiency eventually trumped artistry. Modern reconstructions have been attempted by historians and engineers curious about the device's actual functionality. These studies confirm that the acoustic properties worked as described, though modern researchers obviously used different testing methods than ancient tyrants employed. But while ancient Greece and Rome were perfecting their artistic execution devices, the ancient Assyrian Empire was developing methods that focused more on psychological terror than aesthetic appeal. Sometimes they figured the most effective execution was one that haunted spectators for the rest of their lives. Part 17. Flaying Alive Assyrian Empire. The ancient Assyrians looked at all these execution methods and thought, what if we removed the skin but kept everything else intact? You're strapped to a wooden frame in the courtyard of an Assyrian palace, surrounded by skilled executioners who approach this task with the same professional attention to detail that other craftsmen might apply to tanning leather. The tools are sharp, well maintained, and specifically designed for precision work on living subjects. The Assyrians chose flaying because it served multiple strategic purposes: maximum terror for enemies, complete humiliation for the condemned, and a warning display that could last for months. It was psychological warfare, execution, and interior decoration all rolled into one horrifyingly efficient package. Your crime was probably rebellion against Assyrian rule or defying the empire in some significant way. The Assyrians were building the world's first major empire and needed execution methods that would convince conquered peoples to stay conquered. Flaying was their solution to the imperial management problem. The process required genuine skill from the executioners. Removing skin without damaging underlying tissue was technically challenging work that demanded training and experience. Assyrian flayers were professional specialists whose expertise was highly valued by the imperial administration. Different regions within the Assyrian Empire developed varying flaying techniques. Some focused on speed and efficiency. Others emphasized prolonging the process for maximum deterrent effect. Regional specialization in execution methods reflected the empire's diverse administrative needs and local preferences. The tools were specifically manufactured for flaying purposes. Sharp knives, precise cutting instruments, and specialized grips were all part of the professional equipment. Assyrian metal workers apparently received commissions for execution tools alongside their regular weapons and household implements. The timing was carefully managed to ensure maximum survival duration during the flaying process. Skilled executioners could remove most of the skin while keeping the victim conscious and alive for extended periods. This wasn't accidental brutality. It was deliberate technical expertise applied to terror production. The display of flayed skins served as long-term psychological warfare. Assyrian palaces were decorated with the preserved skins of rebels and enemies, creating interior design schemes that sent clear messages about the consequences of opposing imperial authority. Ancient interior decorating had some disturbing themes. Professional embalmers worked alongside executioners to preserve flayed skins for display purposes. The Assyrians developed techniques for treating human skin like leather, ensuring that their gruesome decorations would last for years. Ancient preservation technology had some unexpected applications. The psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate victims. Assyrian flaying displays were designed to terrorize entire populations into submission, and historical records suggest they were remarkably effective. Fear-based imperial management apparently worked quite well in the ancient world. Different types of criminals received different flaying treatments based on their social status and crimes. Important rebels got prominent display positions, while minor offenders were processed more quickly and displayed less prominently. Even in execution, Assyrian social hierarchies were maintained. The crowds at flaying executions were carefully managed by imperial authorities. These events were state-sponsored terrorism, designed to reinforce political messages rather than provide entertainment. Assyrian execution audiences were participants in imperial ideology rather than casual spectators. Some flaying victims survived the initial process and lived for days afterward, providing extended educational opportunities for observers. Assyrian medical knowledge was advanced enough to keep flayed prisoners alive longer than might seem possible, turning execution into prolonged demonstration. The method was so effective that other ancient empires adopted similar techniques. Persians, Babylonians, and various smaller kingdoms all experimented with flaying as both execution method and psychological warfare tool. Ancient military technology included terror techniques alongside conventional weapons. The practice gradually declined as other empires developed different approaches to population control and punishment. The administrative overhead of maintaining flaying operations was considerable, and simpler execution methods eventually proved more cost-effective for routine imperial management. But while the Assyrians were perfecting their skin removal techniques, the Mongol Empire was developing execution methods that reflected their nomadic culture and military values. Sometimes they figured the most respectful execution was one that avoided spilling noble blood entirely. Part 18. Blow to the Head Mongol Empire. The Mongols looked at all these elaborate execution methods and thought, why complicate things when a good old-fashioned skull-crushing works perfectly well? You're kneeling on the steps outside a Mongol camp, hands bound behind your back, while a Mongol warrior selects an appropriately sized club from his collection. The whole process has a business-like efficiency that suggests this isn't anyone's first time dealing with this particular administrative task. The Mongols chose blunt force execution for practical and cultural reasons. Their nomadic lifestyle required portable execution methods that didn't need special equipment or elaborate setup procedures. A club or mace could travel anywhere and work effectively regardless of local conditions or available resources. Your crime was probably betraying the Great Khan, refusing to surrender when offered the chance, or being a noble from a conquered people who needed to die without bloodshed. Mongol execution etiquette had specific rules about avoiding spilled blood for certain social classes, particularly nobility. The Mongol belief system held that spilling noble blood on the ground would anger the spirits and bring bad luck. Blunt force trauma avoided this problem while still providing definitive execution results. Ancient superstition shaped execution methodology in surprisingly specific ways. Different Mongol generals developed their own preferred techniques for head-crushing executions. Some favored single massive blows for quick results. Others used multiple lighter strikes for more controlled outcomes. Professional preferences in skull crushing showed remarkable individual variation. The tools varied depending on what was available and the executioner's personal preferences. War clubs, maces, hammers, and even rocks served as execution implements. Mongol pragmatism extended to using whatever blunt objects were convenient for the task at hand. The timing was usually swift and efficient. Mongols valued military efficiency in all operations, including execution, and didn't waste time on elaborate ceremonies or prolonged procedures. Quick, decisive action was preferred over dramatic spectacle or psychological torture. Some executions involved entire groups of prisoners being processed simultaneously by multiple executioners working in coordination. Mongol mass execution techniques were developed for handling large numbers of captured enemies efficiently and without excessive time investment. The psychological impact on surviving enemies was considerable. Mongol execution efficiency demonstrated their military professionalism and ruthless practicality, which often convinced other enemies to surrender rather than face similar treatment. Effective execution served as military propaganda. Different regions within the Mongol Empire adapted head-crushing techniques to local conditions and available materials. Desert campaigns used different tools than mountain warfare, and urban conquests had different requirements than steppe battles. Mongol adaptability extended to execution methodology. The social status of both executioner and victim influenced the specific techniques used. High-ranking Mongol officers personally executed important prisoners, while common soldiers handled routine cases. Execution was integrated into the military hierarchy and chain of command. Weather and terrain affected execution procedures in nomadic contexts. Winter executions required different techniques than summer ones, and rocky terrain provided different tool options than grasslands. Mongol execution planning included environmental considerations. Some prisoners were offered alternative fates if they possessed valuable skills or information. Mongol pragmatism included cost-benefit analysis for execution decisions, weighing the value of killing someone against the potential benefits of keeping them alive for specialized purposes. The method was so efficient that it remained standard Mongol practice throughout their period of expansion. From China to Eastern Europe, Mongol armies used consistent execution techniques that reflected their military culture and practical requirements. Imperial standardization included death administration procedures. Historical records from conquered territories describe Mongol execution efficiency with mixture of horror and grudging respect. Medieval chroniclers were impressed by the systematic nature of Mongol military operations, including their approach to handling prisoners and administering justice. But while the Mongols were perfecting their efficient land-based execution methods, maritime cultures were developing execution techniques specifically designed for shipboard conditions. Sometimes they figured, The ocean itself should participate in the punishment process. Part 19. Keel hauling 17th century pirates, Dutch Navy. Maritime cultures looked at all these land-based execution methods and thought, what if we use the ship itself as an execution device? You're standing on the deck of a Dutch warship, hands bound and a rope tied around your waist, while sailors prepare to drag you underneath the ship's hull from bow to stern. The barnacles covering the bottom of the vessel look particularly sharp today, and the crew seems grimly professional about the whole procedure. The Dutch Navy developed keel hauling as both punishment and execution method because it was perfectly suited to shipboard conditions. No special equipment needed beyond rope, and the ocean provided convenient body disposal afterward. Naval efficiency at its finest, really. Your crime was probably mutiny, desertion, or theft from fellow crew members, offences that threatened ship discipline and crew survival. Life at sea required absolute cooperation, and keel hauling was designed to discourage behaviours that could get everyone killed in storms or battles. The process involved being dragged under the ship's keel while the vessel was stationary or moving slowly. The barnacle-encrusted hull acted like a giant cheese grater, while the water pressure and lack of air created additional life-threatening complications. Maritime execution was remarkably multifaceted. Different ships had different keel hauling traditions depending on their size and hull condition. Larger vessels provided longer underwater journeys, while heavily barnacled hulls increased the cutting damage. Ship maintenance ironically affected execution severity, creating unintended consequences for naval discipline. The rope work required genuine sailor skills, proper knots, correct timing, and coordinated crew effort were essential for effective keel hauling. Naval executioners were regular sailors using their professional maritime skills for punishment purposes rather than specialized death administrators. Some keel hauling victims survived the experience, though usually with severe injuries that served as permanent reminders of naval justice. Survival rates depended on factors like water temperature, hull condition, rope length, and the victim's swimming ability and lung capacity. The timing varied based on whether the ship was moving and how far the victim had to travel under the hull. Quick keel hauling might last 30 seconds, while extended versions could take several minutes. Naval commanders could adjust the severity based on the crime and desired outcome. Pirate ships adopted keel hauling from naval traditions, but often modified the procedures based on their own criminal justice needs. Pirate keel hauling sometimes included additional elements like weights or longer ropes, reflecting the creative problem-solving skills that made piracy a viable career option. The psychological impact on crew members was considerable. Watching someone disappear under the ship and emerge bloody and half-drowned created powerful motivation for following orders and maintaining discipline. Naval obedience was reinforced through vivid demonstrations of disobedience consequences. Weather conditions affected keel hauling severity. Rough seas made the process more dangerous for everyone involved, while calm weather allowed for more controlled procedures. Naval execution planning had to account for meteorological variables that land-based methods didn't face. Different navies developed their own keel hauling variations. The English preferred ducking, partial submersion rather than full hull dragging. The Spanish used estrapado, dropping from height into water. Maritime execution methods showed cultural variation even within similar seafaring traditions. The practice was eventually banned by most navies as military discipline evolved toward less brutal methods. The last recorded naval keel hauling was in the 18th century, though some pirate crews probably continued the tradition longer. Military modernization included execution reform. Modern maritime archaeology has found evidence of keel hauling in shipwreck sites, where rope marks on hulls and human remains suggest the practice was more common than official records indicate. Ancient seafaring left physical evidence of its brutal justice systems. The method influenced later naval punishment traditions that stopped short of execution. Flogging around the fleet and other maritime punishments borrowed elements from keel hauling while reducing the mortality rate. Naval discipline evolved but retained some traditional elements. But while maritime cultures were perfecting their ocean-based execution methods, 20th century military organizations were developing mass execution techniques that combined traditional firing squads with modern organizational efficiency. Sometimes, they figured multiple rifles were better than elaborate individual punishments. Part 21. Firing Squad 20th Century Global. The 20th century looked at all these elaborate historical execution methods and thought, you're standing against a brick wall in a prison courtyard, hands tied behind your back, while 5 soldiers check their rifles with the methodical precision that military training provides. One of those rifles contains a blank cartridge, which means 4 people will definitely kill you, and 1 will spend the rest of their life wondering if they were the lucky one. Military organizations chose firing squads because they were efficient, reliable, and distributed responsibility among multiple executioners. No single person bore the full moral weight of the killing, which was psychologically easier for the shooters and administratively simpler for the military bureaucracy managing the whole process. Your crime was probably desertion, treason, espionage, or some other military offense that threatened unit cohesion or national security. Firing squads were primarily military justice, though some civilian governments adopted the method for political prisoners and enemies of the state. The 5-rifle standard became common because it provided redundancy while maintaining plausible deniability for individual shooters. Military planners understood that asking soldiers to kill bound prisoners required psychological safeguards, and the blank cartridge system provided just enough doubt to make the job bearable. Different armies developed different firing squad protocols based on their military traditions and available resources. Some used standing positions, others preferred kneeling formations. The French developed elaborate ceremonial procedures, while the Germans focused on efficiency and speed. The rifles were usually standard military weapons rather than specialized execution equipment. This meant firing squads could be organized anywhere with minimal preparation time, making the method ideal for wartime conditions or military expeditions far from established execution facilities. Target practice was apparently a thing for firing squad members. Military executioners received training in accurate shooting at close range, which is a somewhat different skill set than battlefield marksmanship. Professional development in the execution business required specialized training programs. The timing was carefully coordinated through military drill procedures. Commands were given in sequence: ready, aim, fire, with specific intervals between each order. Military precision extended to execution timing, ensuring simultaneous shots for maximum efficiency and minimum suffering. Some condemned prisoners were offered blindfolds. Others preferred to face their executioners directly. Military protocols usually allowed personal choice in this matter, which was one of the few areas where individual preference was accommodated in the standardized execution process. The location was typically a prison courtyard or military facility with appropriate backstops for the bullets. Military planners had to consider safety for the firing squad and spectators, which required some basic ballistics knowledge and sight preparation. Weather could affect firing squad accuracy, though military training was designed to account for various environmental conditions. Wind, rain, and lighting all influenced shot placement, which executioners had to consider when aiming for quick, clean kills. Different countries used firing squads for different types of crimes. Military courts martial typically reserved the method for serious offences, while some authoritarian governments used firing squads for political dissidents and civilian criminals. The method's flexibility made it popular with various justice systems. The psychological impact on military units was carefully managed through rotation policies and counseling services. Armies understood that repeated execution duty could affect soldier morale and effectiveness, so firing squad assignments were typically distributed among available personnel rather than creating specialist execution units. Some firing squad executions became historically significant events. Mata Hari's execution in World War I, various resistance fighters during World War II, and political prisoners during Cold War conflicts all used firing squads, making the method part of major historical narratives. The practice continues in some countries today, though international pressure has reduced its use significantly. Military justice systems have largely moved toward other methods, though firing squads remain available in a few jurisdictions as backup options when other execution methods are unavailable. But while military organizations were perfecting their rifle-based justice systems, civilian governments were experimenting with chemical solutions that promised even more clinical and controlled death administration. Part 22. Gas Chamber Mid-20th Century America. Mid-20th century America looked at firing squads and electric chairs and thought, what we need is something that looks more scientific and less obviously violent. You're sitting in a sealed chamber that resembles a small laboratory, strapped to a chair while technicians outside prepare chemical pellets that will soon fill the room with hydrogen cyanide gas. The whole setup has the sterile efficiency of a medical procedure, which is probably intentional given America's preference for making execution look clinical. American states chose gas chambers because they appeared more humane and scientific than electric chairs or hanging. The process looked like a chemistry experiment rather than an execution, which made everyone feel more civilized about state-sponsored killing. Appearances mattered enormously in 20th century American justice. Your crime was probably murder, though some states use gas chambers for other capital offenses like kidnapping or rape. The method was reserved for the most serious crimes, and the elaborate chamber construction meant it was only practical for jurisdictions with sufficient execution volume to justify the infrastructure investment. The gas chamber required significant technical expertise to operate safely. Prison staff needed training in chemistry, ventilation systems, and safety protocols to prevent accidental deaths among executioners and witnesses. American execution had become a technical profession, requiring specialized education. Different states built different chamber designs based on their budgets and engineering preferences. Some used circular chambers, others preferred rectangular designs. California's gas chamber at San Quentin became the model that other states copied, creating standardization in execution architecture. The chemical process involved dropping sodium cyanide pellets into sulfuric acid, which produced hydrogen cyanide gas that displaced oxygen in the chamber. Prison chemists had to calculate precise quantities based on chamber volume and atmospheric conditions, turning execution into applied chemistry. The timing was supposed to be Quickerman consciousness within seconds, death within minutes. However, some executions took much longer than expected, with condemned prisoners remaining conscious and struggling against the gas for extended periods. Scientific execution didn't always work as advertised. Witnesses watched through thick glass windows while the condemned person inhaled the deadly gas. The visual separation created psychological distance between observers and the execution, making it easier for officials to maintain the illusion that this was medical procedure rather than deliberate killing. Safety protocols for gas chamber operation were extensive. Prison staff wore protective equipment, ventilation systems were tested regularly, and emergency procedures were established for equipment failures. American execution had developed comprehensive occupational safety standards. The method became politically problematic due to its association with Nazi death camps during World War II. Americans began questioning whether using the same execution method as genocidal regimes sent the wrong message about their justice system. Historical context influenced execution politics. Some condemned prisoners held their breath or hyperventilated to speed up or delay the process, showing that even in gas chambers, individual choice could affect execution outcomes. Human agency persisted even in the most controlled execution environments. Maintenance of gas chambers required specialized contractors and regular equipment inspections. Seals, ventilation systems, and chemical storage all needed professional attention to ensure safe operation. American execution infrastructure had become surprisingly complex and expensive to maintain. The last gas chamber execution in America was in 1999, though some states retain the option for prisoners sentenced before certain dates. Most jurisdictions switched to lethal injection as their primary method, finding it easier to manage and less historically problematic. Prison staff who operated gas chambers often required psychological counseling after executions. The clinical appearance of the method, didn't reduce the emotional impact on personnel responsible for killing people professionally. Mental health support became standard for execution workers. But while America was experimenting with chemical execution methods, they were simultaneously developing electrical solutions that promised even more scientific precision in the death administration business. Part 23. Electric Chair, 20th Century USA. Late 19th century America looked at hanging and thought, what this country needs is more electricity and less rope. You're sitting in a wooden chair that's been fitted with metal electrodes, leather straps, and enough electrical equipment to power a small appliance store. The whole contraption looks like something a mad scientist might build after reading too many Thomas Edison patents and deciding to apply electrical innovation to the execution business. American inventors chose electrocution because it seemed more modern and scientific than hanging or beheading. The electric chair was supposed to represent technological progress applied to capital punishment, showing that America could execute people with the same innovative spirit that built railroads and telegraph systems. Your crime was probably murder, though early electric chair executions included various capital offenses depending on state laws. The method was expensive enough that it was reserved for serious crimes and jurisdictions with sufficient budgets to build and maintain the necessary electrical infrastructure. Thomas Edison promoted electrocution as a humane alternative to hanging, though his motivations included discrediting alternating current electricity in his ongoing competition with Westinghouse. Early electric chair development was influenced by corporate electrical politics as much as humanitarian concerns. The first electric chair execution was William Kemmler in 1890, and it didn't go smoothly. The initial shock failed to kill him, requiring a second electrical application that caused smoke and burning. Technical difficulties plagued early electric chair operations, undermining claims about scientific precision. Different states built different electric chair designs based on available electrical systems and local manufacturing capabilities. Some used alternating current, others preferred direct current. Regional variation in electrical infrastructure influenced execution methodology in surprisingly technical ways. The electrical specifications required genuine engineering expertise. Voltage, amperage, duration, and electrode placement all had to be calculated for effective execution without excessive burning or other unpleasant side effects. American execution had become an electrical engineering problem. Prison electricians became specialized execution technicians who understood both electrical systems and human physiology. These workers needed training in power systems, safety protocols, and the specific requirements of controlled electrocution. Job specialization in execution reached new technical heights. The timing involved multiple electrical shocks delivered in sequence. Initial high-voltage application was followed by lower-voltage maintenance current, then additional high-voltage shocks if necessary. Electric chair operation required complex timing protocols that resembled industrial electrical procedures. Witnesses reported various disturbing effects during electric chair executions: smoke, burning smells, body movements, and occasionally visible flames. The scientific appearance of the method was undermined by obviously unpleasant physical effects that reminded everyone this was still deliberate killing. Safety requirements for electric chair operation were extensive. Prison staff wore protective equipment. Electrical systems were tested before each execution, and emergency shutdown procedures were established for equipment failures. American execution had developed comprehensive workplace safety standards. Some executions required multiple electrical applications when the initial shocks failed to cause death. These botched electrocutions could last for many minutes and involved repeated shocking until the condemned person finally died. Technical reliability remained problematic throughout the electric chair's history. Maintenance of electric chairs required specialized electrical contractors and regular equipment inspections. Generators, transformers, switches, and wiring all needed professional attention to ensure safe and effective operation. American execution infrastructure had become surprisingly complex and expensive. The method gradually fell out of favor as lethal injection became available. though some states retain electric chairs as backup options. Most jurisdictions found that chemical execution appeared more humane and generated fewer disturbing sensory effects for witnesses and staff. Modern electric chair executions are rare but still occur occasionally in states that offer condemned prisoners' choice of execution methods. Some prisoners choose electrocution over lethal injection, though the reasons for this preference vary and are often not publicly explained. But while America was perfecting electrical execution technology, they were simultaneously developing chemical methods that promised to make death administration look more like medical treatment than criminal punishment. Part 24. Honor Suicide Feudal Japan. Feudal Japan looked at all these execution methods and thought, what if we let people kill themselves with proper ceremony and spiritual significance? You're kneeling on a tatami mat in a carefully arranged formal garden, wearing pure white ceremonial robes that cost more than most peasants earned in a year. The tanto blade in your hands has been sharpened to perfection and blessed by Shinto priests who probably charged extra for their blessing services. A kaishakunin stands behind you with a katana that's been in his family for generations, ready to complete the process if your own efforts prove insufficient. Japanese society chose seppuku because it allowed condemned individuals to die with honor intact, rather than suffering the shame of execution by others. The method preserved social dignity, while still providing definitive death, which satisfied both justice requirements and cultural values about proper behavior in crisis situations. It was essentially premium execution for people with good social standing. Your crime was probably bringing dishonor to your lord, failing spectacularly in military duty, or committing some act that violated the samurai code of conduct so severely that living with the shame wasn't an option. Seppuku was reserved for the warrior class, and others of sufficient social standing to merit honorable death rather than common criminal execution. The whole concept grew out of Japanese beliefs about honor, shame, and spiritual purity that would seem completely alien to most modern people. In feudal Japan, your reputation and social standing were literally more important than your life. Death with honor was preferable to life with disgrace, which created a culture where ritual suicide became not just acceptable, but sometimes mandatory. The ritual aspects were elaborate and highly regulated by centuries of tradition. Specific clothing requirements, ceremonial objects, witness protocols, and procedural steps were all precisely defined by cultural development that treated death as performance art. Japanese execution had become spiritual theater with life and death stakes. The preparation process could take days or even weeks. Condemned samurai would arrange their affairs, write final poems, distribute personal possessions, and engage in spiritual purification rituals that prepared them mentally and spiritually for honorable death. It was like planning an extremely permanent retirement party. The tanto blade was traditionally a family heirloom or specially commissioned weapon that carried spiritual significance and represented the condemned person's connection to ancestral honor and family tradition. Some families had ceremonial seppuku blades that were passed down through generations, which is probably the most morbid family heirloom tradition in human history. Different periods of Japanese history had different seppuku traditions that reflected changing social conditions and cultural developments. Medieval practices were simpler and more functional, while later elaborate ceremonies developed during the peaceful Edo period when people had time to perfect ritual execution procedures. Peace apparently made death more complicated. The location was carefully chosen for spiritual and aesthetic reasons. Formal gardens, temple grounds, or specially prepared rooms provided appropriate settings for honorable death. Japanese culture applied the same attention to beautiful death settings that other cultures reserved for wedding venues or religious ceremonies. The kaishakunin was usually a close friend, respected colleague or family member, chosen for their skill with a sword and their personal relationship with the condemned person. This wasn't random executioner assignment. It was careful selection of someone who could provide both technical competence and emotional support during the final moments. The selection process for kaishakunin was surprisingly complex. The person needed excellent swordsmanship skills, emotional stability, and the social standing to participate in such an important ceremony. Some samurai specialized in serving as kaishakunin and developed reputations for their skill and reliability in this role. The cutting technique was specific and symbolically significant. The horizontal cut across the abdomen represented opening the seat of courage and honor, allowing the soul to escape properly according to Japanese spiritual beliefs. It wasn't just suicide, it was spiritual release performed according to precise cultural and religious requirements. Different schools of swordsmanship taught different seppuku techniques, including proper blade angles, cutting depth, and timing for the abdominal incision. Even ritual suicide had technical standards that were taught and practiced like any other martial art. Japanese perfectionism extended to every aspect of life and death. The timing was controlled by the person committing seppuku, who could choose when to begin the process and how long to continue before signaling for assistance from the kaishakunin. Individual agency was preserved even in death, which distinguished Japanese honor suicide from involuntary execution methods used by other cultures. Some seppuku ceremonies included final poems, letters to family members, and distribution of personal possessions that had been prepared in advance. The extended preparation period allowed for proper spiritual and practical arrangements that regular executions couldn't accommodate. Death planning was apparently an art form in feudal Japan. The poetry tradition was particularly important. Condemned samurai were expected to compose death poems that reflected their spiritual state, expressed gratitude to their lords, and demonstrated their cultural refinement even in final moments. Literary criticism extended to execution poetry, which added extra pressure to an already stressful situation. Women occasionally performed jigai, a similar honor suicide using a blade to the throat rather than disembowelment. Female honor suicide had different techniques, but similar cultural significance, showing that Japanese death rituals accommodated gender differences while maintaining core spiritual principles. Equal opportunity ritual suicide, essentially, the female version required different preparation and ceremony. Women would bind their legs together to ensure their bodies were found in dignified positions, wear special white kimonos, and often cut the carotid artery rather than attempting abdominal cutting. Japanese attention to detail extended to gender-specific execution protocols. Foreign observers found seppuku both horrifying and impressive, often commenting on the courage required to disembowel oneself voluntarily. Western cultures struggled to understand honor-based suicide, viewing it as either barbaric self-destruction or remarkably brave spiritual commitment, depending on their cultural perspective and personal biases. Portuguese missionaries who witnessed seppuku ceremonies were particularly conflicted. Christian theology condemned suicide as sinful, but the obvious spiritual significance and dignified nature of Japanese ritual death challenged their assumptions about pagan practices. Cultural exchange sometimes produced uncomfortable moral questions. Dutch traders developed business relationships with samurai families and occasionally attended seppuku ceremonies as honored witnesses. They wrote detailed accounts of the procedures that provided European audiences with first-hand descriptions of Japanese honor culture. International business networking had some unusual aspects in feudal Japan. The spiritual preparation involved extensive meditation, prayer, and consultation with Buddhist monks or Shinto priests who helped the condemned achieve proper mental state for honorable death. Japanese religion integrated seamlessly with execution practices, creating spiritual frameworks for ending life with dignity. Some samurai spent their final days in temple retreats, engaging in intensive spiritual practice that prepared them psychologically for self-destruction. Monastic communities developed specialized programs for supporting condemned warriors through their final spiritual journey. Death preparation became a religious service industry. The economic aspects were surprisingly complex. Seppuku ceremonies required significant financial investment in ceremonial objects, proper clothing, spiritual services, and elaborate funeral arrangements. Honorable death was expensive, which meant social class affected execution quality, even in cultures that emphasized spiritual equality. Wealthy families competed to provide the most elaborate seppuku ceremonies for their disgraced members, turning honorable death into displays of family status and cultural refinement. social competition extended to execution planning, which shows how deeply honor culture penetrated Japanese society. The practice officially ended during the Meiji Restoration, when Japan modernized its legal system and adopted Western approaches to criminal justice. Traditional honor concepts were discouraged as the country sought international respectability and modern legal frameworks. Political modernization required cultural change, including execution reform. Military officers occasionally committed seppuku during World War II, showing that traditional honor concepts persisted despite legal modernization and cultural westernization. Ancient execution traditions sometimes resurface during national crises when people seek connection to traditional values and spiritual practices. The most famous modern seppuku was performed by writer Yukio Mishima in 1970, who used ritual suicide to protest Japan's post-war pacifism and cultural westernization. His death demonstrated that seppuku remained a powerful cultural symbol even in contemporary Japan, though most people viewed it as anachronistic extremism. Modern Japan has largely abandoned seppuku as a cultural practice, though the concept of honor-based suicide still influences contemporary attitudes about responsibility, shame, and appropriate responses to public disgrace. Historical execution methods sometimes survive as cultural concepts, even when actual practices disappear from legal systems. Corporate executives occasionally commit suicide when their companies fail or engage in criminal behavior. Contemporary Japanese business suicide isn't ritualized like historical seppuku, but it demonstrates cultural continuity in attitudes about personal responsibility and shame management. The influence of seppuku culture extended beyond Japan through martial arts, literature, and film that introduced global audiences to concepts of honorable death and ritual suicide. Japanese execution traditions became part of international popular culture, though usually without understanding the deep spiritual and social significance. But while Japan was developing elaborate honor-based suicide rituals, the modern world was creating new forms of execution designed for maximum psychological impact and global media distribution. Sometimes, apparently, the point wasn't honorable death, but terrorizing the largest possible audience. Part 25, Modern Beheading and Final Reflections, extended. The 21st century brought execution full circle, returning to one of humanity's oldest methods, but with modern technology and global media distribution that would make medieval executioners weep with envy. You're kneeling in an undisclosed location somewhere in the Middle East, hands bound behind your back, while masked figures prepare professional video equipment alongside traditional blades. Modern beheading isn't just about killing people, it's about broadcasting that killing to the widest possible global audience through internet distribution, social media platforms, and viral marketing techniques that major corporations would study with admiration. Terrorist organizations chose beheading because it maximizes psychological impact while requiring minimal resources and infrastructure. A sharp knife, decent video camera, and reliable internet connection can create more international terror than elaborate execution chambers or expensive pharmaceutical protocols. Modern execution technology has been democratized through digital media and global communications. Your crime was probably being in the wrong place at the wrong time, representing a government or organization that terrorists wanted to intimidate, or simply holding a passport from a country they considered an enemy. Modern terrorist beheading often targets symbols rather than specific criminal behavior, turning individual deaths into propaganda statements about international politics. The filming process has become as important as the actual execution, with multiple camera angles, professional editing software, and strategic distribution through social media platforms that turn individual executions into global propaganda events. Modern execution is performance art designed for viral distribution and maximum psychological impact on international audiences. Different terrorist groups develop different beheading presentation styles based on their political messaging needs. Some focused on religious rhetoric and spiritual justification, others emphasized political demands and ideological content. while a few specialized in pure intimidation without complex messaging beyond basic fear production. The victims are often chosen specifically for their symbolic value rather than personal actions or individual crimes. Journalists representing press freedom, aid workers symbolizing international compassion, military personnel representing state power, and random civilians embodying ordinary citizens all serve different propaganda purposes depending on the specific message terrorists want to communicate. The production values have evolved significantly over the past 2 decades. Early terrorist videos were crude affairs with poor lighting and amateur editing, but modern executions often feature professional cinematography, sophisticated audio production, and polished post-production work that rivals commercial video content. Death has entered the entertainment industry. The global reach of modern communication means that beheading videos can influence political decisions, public opinion, and international relations worldwide within hours of being recorded and distributed. Ancient execution methods, combined with modern technology, create unprecedented psychological warfare capabilities that transcend geographic boundaries and traditional diplomatic channels. Internet platforms struggle constantly with content moderation for execution videos, creating ongoing debates about free speech, censorship, platform responsibility, and the appropriate limits on communication technology. Modern beheading has forced global discussions about corporate responsibilities and the ethics of information distribution in democratic societies. The speed of distribution creates new psychological impacts that historical executions couldn't achieve. Medieval public executions required physical presence and limited audiences to local populations, but modern terrorist beheadings can traumatize millions of people simultaneously across different continents and cultures. Execution has become truly globalized. Government responses to terrorist beheading videos have included military interventions, policy changes, and international cooperation agreements that demonstrate how individual executions can influence global politics. Single deaths now routinely trigger international incidents that affect millions of people and reshape diplomatic relationships between nations. The copycat effect has created international networks of terrorist groups that share execution techniques, video production methods, and distribution strategies. Modern beheading has become a standardized propaganda tool used by various organizations worldwide, showing how execution methods spread through global communication networks. Law enforcement agencies have developed specialized units for tracking, analyzing, and responding to execution videos that require expertise in digital forensics, international law, and psychological warfare. Modern police work includes execution video analysis as a routine investigative technique for counter-terrorism operations. The psychological impact on families and communities has been amplified by global media coverage that turns individual tragedies into international news events. Modern beheading victims become global symbols rather than private losses, creating new forms of grief and trauma that historical executions couldn't produce. But stepping back from these contemporary horrors, our comprehensive journey through execution history reveals remarkable consistency in human behavior across all civilizations, time periods, and technological development levels. Every society has found ways to kill people officially, and those methods invariably reflect their values, available technologies, social structures, and cultural priorities. From Roman crosses designed for maximum public humiliation to American gurneys built to create medical appearance, our technological progress, changing moral sensibilities, persistent creativity in problem solving, and remarkable psychological ability to convince ourselves that whatever we're currently doing is more civilized, humane, and justifiable than whatever came before. The evolution demonstrates both genuine progress and disturbing continuity in human nature. We've reduced public spectacle in most cases, increased procedural safeguards and legal protections, developed more reliable methods that reduce suffering, and created international laws governing execution practices. But we're still fundamentally using organized state power to end human lives for public purposes, just like our ancestors did thousands of years ago. The technological sophistication has increased dramatically. Ancient executioners used simple tools like ropes, axes, and fire, while modern execution involves complex pharmaceutical protocols, electrical systems, and chemical processes that require professional expertise and significant financial investment. Death administration has become a technical specialty requiring specialized education and training. The legal frameworks have become extraordinarily complex compared to historical justice systems. Modern executions require extensive court proceedings, multiple appeals processes, specialized legal representation, and procedural safeguards that can take decades to complete. Ancient rulers could order executions immediately, while modern democracies have created elaborate bureaucratic systems for death administration. Perhaps most remarkably, every generation throughout history believed their execution techniques were reasonable, necessary, and probably more humane than previous methods. Romans thought crucifixion represented civilized justice compared to barbaric tribal practices. Medieval Europeans saw burning as spiritual purification superior to pagan violence. Modern Americans view lethal injection as medical procedure that transcends primitive execution methods. This consistent pattern of moral self-congratulation suggests that future civilizations will probably view our current execution methods with the same horror and bewilderment that we feel when studying historical practices. Chemical execution may seem as barbaric to them as medieval torture seems to us today. They'll probably look back at our execution chambers the way we examine ancient amphitheaters and medieval dungeons. The social aspects have remained surprisingly consistent across different cultures and time periods. Execution has always served multiple purposes beyond simple punishment, deterring future crimes, satisfying public demands for justice, reinforcing social hierarchies, demonstrating state power, and providing emotional catharsis for communities affected by serious crimes. The specific methods change, but the underlying social functions remain constant. The economic considerations have become increasingly important in modern execution systems. Historical methods like hanging or beheading required minimal financial investment, while contemporary execution involves millions of dollars in legal proceedings, specialized facilities, professional staff, and complex logistics. Death administration has become an expensive government service that consumes significant public resources. The international dimensions represent genuinely new developments in execution history. Ancient and medieval executions were primarily local or national affairs, while modern execution practices are subject to international law, diplomatic pressure, and global public opinion. Execution has become an international political issue that affects relationships between countries and influences global governance. History suggests that future generations will probably develop their own solutions to the eternal human problem of what to do with people who break society's most important rules. The specific methods will undoubtedly change as technology advances and moral sensibilities evolve, but the fundamental challenge of managing serious criminal behavior will remain constant across all human civilizations. The techniques have evolved dramatically from community participation in ancient stoning to professional administration in modern execution chambers, from public spectacle designed for mass education to private procedures conducted for small witness groups, and from crude tools requiring minimal skill to sophisticated technology demanding specialized expertise. But the underlying human struggle with institutionalized killing continues across all civilizations and historical periods. At least we've made genuine progress in one significant area. Most modern executions aren't family entertainment events with vendors selling refreshments, children playing games nearby, and couples treating execution attendance as romantic date activities. That represents meaningful moral advancement, even if the basic practice continues in modified forms. The psychological understanding has improved considerably. Modern execution systems recognize the mental health impact on everyone involved: condemned prisoners, execution staff, witnesses, and affected communities. Historical executions treated psychological trauma as irrelevant or even beneficial, while contemporary approaches include counseling services, support programs, and mental health resources for people affected by execution processes. The documentation has become incredibly detailed compared to historical records. Modern executions are extensively documented through legal proceedings, medical records, witness statements, and official reports that create comprehensive archives for future historical analysis. Ancient executions are often known only through scattered historical accounts that may be inaccurate or incomplete. And so ends our comprehensive educational tour through humanity's most persistent and creative hobby. From ancient stoning circles where entire communities participated in collective killing, to modern execution chambers where trained professionals administered death through sophisticated medical procedures, we've demonstrated remarkable innovation in the death administration business while consistently believing we're more civilized than whoever came before us. The journey reveals both the best and worst aspects of human nature, our capacity for cruelty and compassion, our technological ingenuity, applied to both creation and destruction, our ability to rationalize almost any behavior through cultural frameworks and moral reasoning, and our persistent hope that we can solve complex social problems through carefully administered violence. Thank you for joining this enlightening journey through history's greatest hits in permanent problem solving. Remember to like and subscribe for more uplifting content about our species' remarkable consistency in finding new and creative ways to solve old problems while convincing ourselves we're making moral progress. Sweet dreams, and try not to think too hard about which execution method you would have preferred if you'd lived in different historical periods. Some questions are better left unanswered, and some knowledge is more disturbing than useful. The end.